as part of this week's Glanbia Ireland Dairy Focus Vodcast. We'll hear from members of our milk quality team on an upcoming virtual farm tour. We'll hear from Joris Somers, our vet, on some topical issues happening on dairy farms at the moment, and we'll go through some grassland advice and management tips now that well-needed rainfall has occurred. Now we'll hear from Joris Somers, who'll bring us through our third installation in the lameness series and also on some topical issues that are arising on dairy farms at the moment.
In part 3 of our lameness series, we will look a bit more into the causes of lameness. See, more than 70% of lameness in dairy cows is actually caused by trauma to their feet and not to higher up in the legs and the joints or anything like that. So an early detection there has been proven to be very vital. So over the last decade, more and more has it been discovered that early detection and early treatment of cases of lameness will benefit them greatly in a quick recovery. And in that sense, lameness is not that different from mastitis. A new case of mastitis that is treated successfully quickly will mean in the long term that cow has a much better chance of not showing a high cell count anymore. Whereas a more chronic case of mastitis with a higher cell count for a longer period of time, that cow is less likely to recover. Lameness is exactly the same. The quicker you can pick up a case of lameness and treat it, the more likely that cow is to recover fully and not show any impact on production or fertility because of that lameness. Whereas a case of lameness that is left to linger for longer will be much harder to cure. So that requires more regular lameness assessment, and as we saw in part 2, it's quite easy to actually pick out lame cows and draft them out for maybe treatment. Now the treatment of those cows, that sort of depends on what is found, but it'll always end up being lifting the cow's foot because there is such a high chance that the lameness is caused by a foot lesion. If the foot lesion is really because there is damage to the hard part of the cow's hoofs, that's usually called traumatic lesions, then a thorough trim of that foot with placing maybe a wooden or rubber block or a rubber shoe on the other toe of that foot, the healthy toe, to just take the pressure off the damaged toe. Lift it off the ground so that it's not impacting onto the ground every time. Will be very good treatment. On top of that, giving those cows some anti-inflammatory injections such as meloxicam, flunixin or ketofen will actually work really well. When it comes to types of lesions that are more infectious in nature, those are usually of the skin either between the toes or just above the heels. Those require a foot bath. And we will focus more on foot bath design and how to manage them in the next part. But foot baths play a vital role in controlling that infectious type of lameness. A few examples of those lesions would be for infectious type lameness. Everybody's heard of Mortellaro, for example, or digital dermatitis, but also fowl would be a good example, or slurry heel. All of those are infectious type foot lesions. On the traumatic side, we have the likes of white line disease or sole hemorrhage or bruising. It often used to be called laminitis, or a solar ulcer as a very severe painful case. The trimming, I've already said, foot trimming for those traumatic lesions together with the blocks and the anti-inflammatories would be seen as a good treatment. Now when we look at what in the cow's environment or the cow management actually leads to those lesions, again we can see a fairly clear distinction between those traumatic type lesions and the infectious type lesions. And for the traumatic lesions, it has to do with both the roadways and then more around the yard, the housing and around the dairy. So for the roadways, for example, the length of the roadways. How long are cows walking each day to and from the parlour, for example, right? So just the sheer distance they have to walk is already important. What makes that even more important is the condition of the roadways they walk on. So are there many exposed stones or loose stones? Sharp stones and more round pebbles, both are not ideal. Are there many potholes on the roadway or deep tractor tracks, for example. All of that will impact how cows walk and how well they can cope with the distance they have to walk. Part of that is also how fast are cows being made to walk on those roadways. See, if a cow is allowed to walk at her own pace, she will actually pick her way very well between those different objects of potholes and loose stones. But if cows are in any way being rushed, and this could be because you're walking behind them, maybe with a stick, or you have a dog with you, or you're using the quad bike to round up the cows and try and get them to the parlour as quickly as possible because you want to get on with milking. All of that makes cows rush up the roadway, and that prevents them from really picking their way and placing their feet where they think it'll be safe. And it makes them step on maybe those stones or into the potholes. And that will lead to more lameness. When it comes to around the yard, and this time of year cows are not using the cubicles, but cubicles are a big factor here. Number of cubicles, have you enough cubicles and then some for the cows in your herd? Cows like to choose where they lie down. So even if you have a cubicle for each cow, not all the cows will decide to lie down because they mightn't like their neighbour. So have some extra cubicles so cows actually have a choice as to where they like to lie down. But the cubicle comfort is important too. So you can have many cubicles, but if they're not comfortable enough, the cows won't make enough use of them. So use this time of year when the cows are not using the cubicles to maybe adjust the neck rail or the brisket board, or put in some new mats or mattresses to improve the cubicle comfort. Cows will then use the cubicles more, so they will be off their feet more for more time during housing, which will then give them more relief, and they won't be standing on concrete all the time. Because concrete, as much benefit as it is to you to keeping things clean around the place and in managing things, concrete is not good on cows' feet. And that brings us to the collecting yard. How long are cows standing in the collecting yard before milking? Has your herd expanded a lot in the last couple of years, but you haven't actually extended the parlour? Have you added on maybe 30 minutes to each milking? That adds up to a lot of extra time of cows standing in the collecting yard for each milking. So it's important then that the conditions in the collecting yard are ideal, but that you do everything you can to minimise the strain put on the cows while they're in the collecting yard. Coming out of the parlour, some herds will have very sharp bends or a fairly narrow passageway that cows try and get through, and they might push and shove, and they might have to do maybe even a 180-degree bend to get back out onto the paddocks. That's not ideal either. All that puts extra strain on the cow's feet. A lot of torsional strength is required there to go around the bend, and it will actually be a big cause in, for example, white line disease. But when it comes to the infectious causes of lameness, the collecting yard is important too. How clean is your collecting yard? Do you scrape the collecting yard after every milking? I know it's tempting to leave it in the evening and scrape it the next morning, but you're not going to scrape it before the cows come back in probably. So you're going to leave it built up for 2 milkings and then scrape it. Well, see, underfoot hygiene is the biggest risk factor for infectious type lesions. So the cleaner you can keep the underfoot conditions, the lower the exposure will be to the bacteria that cause these lesions. And the same applies for the cubicle shed. Have you scrapers in the shed? Maybe they need to run more often. Are they actually being effective? Are they removing the dung from the cubicles or from the passageways? All of that needs to be considered when you do have, for example, a mortellaro issue. So it's important to do those things. But even the hygiene on the roadways. Maybe there's a section on your roadway that is prone to flooding. Can you do something about that? Maybe raise it up or dig a bit of a channel so that the water can run off. And even if only temporarily, you can put down a good bit of wood chip, for example. That alone will already help with those patches in the roadway. Over the last couple of weeks, there have been a number of reports on cows eating stones, licking walls and so on, which is, as a medical term goes, it's often referred to as Pica. And quite often it is related to either a mineral deficiency or lack of fibre in the cow's diet. And just given the time of year it is, the lack of fibre should probably be high up enough on that list rather than some of the other mineral deficiencies, just for this time of year and the grazing situation that we've gone through. So providing that maybe salt licks to the cows and they will correct the mineral deficiency themselves, because quite often it's just salt or sodium that they're missing, and cows, that's why they're licking the stones, they're looking for sodium. But if it's a fibre issue, obviously then just provide some more fibre, maybe some hay or straw, or a bit of stemmy silage, even if it's just at the barrier when they're coming out of the parlour for half an hour or an hour after each milking, that they can get some of that fibre into them. Because one of the side effects of this pica is that cows go and forage, they try and find places to lick, and they might end up going into ditches or hedges and finding foreign objects like nails and wires that they shouldn't be eating in the first place. But they can also come across discarded car and tractor batteries, which, if they get their hands on them, will actually lead to lead poisoning in the cows, which for most cows means that they will die within 24 to 48 hours. So it's really something to keep an eye out. If you have cows showing these signs of pica, make sure they can't get at places where they're not supposed to go.
Now we'll hear from Paddy Dempsey on some topical fertiliser advice now that rain has fallen.
Hi folks, and welcome to today's Vodcast. Today I want to talk to you about getting back up to date with fertiliser applications after the recent drought or soil moisture deficit, depending on the part of the country that you're in. The key areas we want to focus on today are targeting the growth of a good crop of second cut silage and keeping up to date with your fertiliser spreading in the current rotation for the grazing block. So for the second cut silage, I know a lot of guys have gone with a split application after the first cut, and they have approximately 30 to 40, 50 units out for the second cut. The key now is to bring that up to 75 to 80 units of nitrogen for the second cut silage. And also remember, this year is different than other years. With the dry spell, a lot of guys didn't put out any slurry, so there's a requirement there to put out some P and K to balance the nutrient offtake for the second cut silage. And I suppose if I give you some key figures to remember, a second cut silage will take off 12 to 16 units of P and 70 to 80 units of potash. So the key is to, if you're not putting out slurry, make sure you have some compound fertiliser going out. So something like a Cutswort or a Silage Elite are ideal in those situations. For the grazing block, the key to remember here is that we need to get out 20 to 30 units of nitrogen on all the grazing block after the cows graze each paddock. And remember, the key is we've eaten a lot of silage during the drought, so in order to get on top of it now, we do need to put out extra fertiliser to grow more grass to replace that silage that was taken off. And under the Great Grass Programme, we look at maximising the grass growth so that we get the most out of the paddocks, and this is essential in this time when we're short of silage because we've eaten into our winter stocks over the last 6 weeks. So again, the requirement for paddocks is, if you're okay for P and K, to use a product like Supernet or Topper Ensure, which has a balance of N and sulphur. And if you're allowed and you have a requirement for P and K, maybe a product like Pasture Sward or Richland are more appropriate. But the key thing is to use 20 to 30 units of nitrogen after each grazing in order to drive the maximum growth at this time of year.
Over the last few weeks, grass growth has been continuously declining week on week. However, due to many areas receiving forecasted heavy rainfall over the last number of days in the past week, grass growth for the first time in the last few consecutive weeks has started to increase according to Pasture Base Ireland. As of the 21st of June, average growth rates recorded on Pasture Base Ireland for Leinster stood at 46 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day, and for Munster that figure was 61 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day. So grass growth increasing, although some areas still seeing growth below 50 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day, but with more rain forecast and soil moisture deficits declining, we should see an increase in that grass growth rate over the next number of days. Although growth rates are picking up, it's extremely important at the moment to allow your average farm cover to recover. In instances where average farm cover was run quite low and had fallen dramatically, allow that average farm cover to build back up in order to have a bank of grass ahead of the grazing mob. If we look specifically at Met Éireann data on rainfall and soil moisture deficits now in the past 7 days compared to the weeks previous, That soil moisture deficit, which was from 60 to in excess of 80 millimetres, has now decreased across the region from 20 to 68 millimetres in those more sill affected areas that have received less rainfall over the last number of days. So in the areas where that has reduced back to 20, we should see typical grass growth levels being achieved. So the key consideration at the moment is to monitor the grass growth that you're achieving on the platform quite closely over the next number of days, and to react accordingly, and to make it again adjust the plan that was made previously when we were in a grass deficit according to what growth you're getting now, what deficit you may still be seeing in some areas, or again where grass growth rates has surged or increased dramatically, making the right decisions about getting cows into the target pre-grazing heights and keeping quality in mind. We want to again make sure we achieve the residuals of 4 centimetres in order to have good quality and high quality grass in the subsequent rotation. Now we'll hear members of our Glanbia Ireland milk quality team who'll talk to us about the upcoming virtual farm tour on the Hearne family farm.
In October 2019, Kieran Hearne and family were crowned the overall winner of the NBC Kerrygold Quality Milk Awards. 13 finalists were shortlisted for these awards, which set out to find and celebrate top quality Irish dairy farmers. Before claiming the overall award, Kieran won the sustainability category. Sustainability rings true in every aspect of how Kieran farms, from the environment and biodiversity, animal welfare and animal health, herd breeding and on-farm labour management. Ordinarily, the winner of this award hosts a farm walk to give an insight into what makes a Quality Milk Award winner. This year, however, due to COVID-19, the Hearne family, in conjunction with Glanbia Ireland, Teagasc, NDC and Ornua, are hosting a webinar and virtual farm walk on Tuesday, the 30th of June. The virtual farm walk will be available on Teagasc, Twitter and Instagram accounts. The webinar will begin at 11 AM and to register, click into teagasc.ie/virtual milk walk.
Hi, my name is Kieran Hearne, and on behalf of Anne and our family, I'd like to welcome you to the Hearne Family Farm. We're the winners of the 2019 NDC Kerrygold Milk Quality Award, and we'd like to welcome you on the 30th of June to our live webinar and virtual farm tour.